Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kratom Sobriety Podcast. This is episode 92, and I am Chris, and I'm here with Libby. How are you doing, Libby?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm good. I almost said that I'm a little bit stressed, but I realize I say that every week when I'm doing the intro. So I'm just going to say I'm good. So our guest this week is Michal, and I can't wait to hear her story. I know you and I were talking a little bit before this episode started just about how different social situations are now that we're not using Kratom or any other substance to navigate those situations. And I think that would be a beneficial thing to talk about this week. I bet a lot of people can relate to that. So can you think of any specific situations that you've had recently or over the last couple months where you've noticed that it's a little bit different without Kratom or without any substance?
I always notice because it was so normal for me to dose up right before a social situation because if I was going to be, at a party for 4 hours, I needed to have enough in my system to get me through the party. So I always feel that heading into social situations. I'm personally an introvert anyway, so I have often relied on substance support. And the things I find really helpful for me are just like having open, honest conversations with my partner about like where I'm at that day and how much, I don't know, social gasoline I have in my gas tank for that. And if we have a safe word or like a safe glance of, hey, I want to be gone by 10 or whatever. But I also really like having a kombucha or something in my hand, like something in my hand to drink because I don't drink alcohol either. Just having something that I feel like I can lean on, if that makes sense, is super helpful for me. What about you?
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Whenever I was using the Kratom, I would, if it was a long social situation, like a long outing, I would literally take whatever dose beforehand. And then depending on how long the situation was, I might even take a little bag of Kratom. It was thinking back on it, I was such a slave to it, but I would make sure that I had enough to get through that social situation because I am also an introvert and sometimes they make me really uncomfortable. But I can totally relate to, I think it was about giving myself grace, especially at the beginning. If there was a situation that I was going into and I just knew it was going to be uncomfortable for me, at the beginning, I didn't even go. But then as I got more comfortable, I would just go for long enough, as long as I could handle, and then leave. And just telling myself that was okay, that people didn't have this crazy expectation of me to be this like charming social butterfly all the time, and that I could take care of myself and leave if I had to. But yeah, I think having something in my hand also, and something fun, like at the beginning, I don't drink alcohol either. I know that there's like some controversy around mocktails and stuff, but I would make like fun juices and like fun drinks that I was excited to consume just to make everything a little more exciting. And it did. It worked. I still do that. I still think that's
Yeah, I've
fun.
definitely had, there are some like mocktails that are like they mimic the taste of alcohol. And I have played around with some of those. And I don't know that they do much for me, but they're fun to try. I don't know. But I can totally relate to the anxiety piece and not really wanting to interact with people for too long. But I find that now that I'm not on Kratom, I am more present and I can last longer in social situations, which is interesting. You would think it would be the opposite because Kratom often gives us this inspiring motivation, but I've just realized it's easier for me to genuinely connect to the people around me. And I'm not feeling so much, all right, we're getting really close to that 9 o'clock dose. I better start making excuses about how I'm going to get out of here. I don't know. I feel like in some ways it's harder because I'm like showing up raw dogging life. But in other ways, I feel more authentic and honestly just more accepted.
Absolutely. I can relate to that a lot. I think that's one of the reasons at first, the only social positions I would put myself in were meetings. I did AA meetings because drinking was also a problem for me, but I mainly went for the Kratom, to be honest. But I liked those social situations in the beginning because I felt like everyone just completely accepted me for where I was in my recovery. Everyone had been through a pretty shitty time themselves. So I didn't feel like I had to act a certain way or bring any, I don't know, certain qualities to the table. I could just be miserable in the beginning and everyone was just there. But now I am just it's definitely challenging. Like as an introvert, it is challenging. I'm not saying it's easy now for me to go into social situations and exist around people, but it's so much more rewarding to know that I'm not some like zombie, to know that I'm going to remember everything clearly, to know that if people like me, it's because they get to know me and not some like zombie form of me that I was on the Kratom. I know they say in AA, be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And it sounds cheesy, but for me, that's been pretty true. Putting myself in situations that might be a little bit hard, but help me grow as a person.
Did you go back to AA meetings after, like, when you were getting off of Kratom too, or was that part of your story coming off of alcohol?
I didn't have a problem with alcohol before the Kratom. So when I started the Kratom really heavily, actually when I got out of rehab for the Kratom last summer, I was trying not to use the Kratom and I was replacing the Kratom with alcohol. So Kratom was my problem first. And then I tried to get off of the Kratom and replaced it with alcohol, and it was a disaster. It was just awful. So I started going to AA meetings really seriously this last quit about 4 months ago, mainly for the Kratom, but I definitely had a problem with alcohol too. That was hand in hand with the Kratom. So
The reason I asked is because I had also been in recovery for alcohol and spent a lot of time in the rooms of AA and like really involved in the community, and then fell off when I picked up Kratom for obvious reasons. But coming back to the rooms after getting off of Kratom, it was like I just felt like such an alien. I didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't feel like I could talk about it. I didn't think like I would be accepted. And I just, yeah. So it's interesting that's why I was asking, because it sounds like you had a pretty good experience.
it's
But
interesting that you say that because, and I don't want to discourage anyone from trying out AA meetings because they really were great for me for a while. But this last month or so, I have been struggling a little bit for that specific reason. I feel like I really need a sponsor who's familiar with Kratom. There are specific details that I feel like people in the rooms might not understand that are very specific to Kratom, not just addiction. So I have found my experience with AA lacking a little bit, and I've been exploring other options like smart recovery. And yeah, so it's interesting that you say that. I have noticed a little bit lately that there's something lacking there for me. Maybe not for everybody, but for me.
yeah, totally. I really AA, and I like everything that it provides you in comparison to like NA and other 12-step programs. I just feel like sometimes the recovery is way stronger, but yeah, I did feel weird, but that's why I like the Kratom sobriety meetings so much.
And I can't believe I haven't gone to any of those.
Never?
I've never been to one. Yeah, I'm not sure why. I know they exist. I will have to check them out
I
in the
would
next
suggest
couple
you
weeks.
check them out. Yeah.
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 What do you like about them so much? Is it this like specificity to Kratom and just
I
everyone
think
kind
that
of
that
knows?
is, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I also think that it's like there's nothing there that people haven't heard. Like no combination of extracts or the blue bottles or the powder that like someone can't relate to. And it's not so strict. Like they do allow some crosstalk. There's like a leader that will reflect back to you on your share. So you feel very heard. And I've always felt like super welcome. I can get really sucked into an introvert mentality where it's I'm not worthy of being here. I'm not going to speak. Whatever I have to say isn't enough or isn't smart enough or interesting enough or whatever. And I get real nervous to talk, and then I just end up not having any introduction to the meeting and the fellowship, and no one knows who I am, and so I don't get the support I need. And that has been my story in a lot of AA meetings. So I haven't felt that way in Kratom sobriety meetings. I felt like really heard and seen and understood and welcome. And
I feel the same way. I'm always scared to talk, and not scared, but I don't know. Sometimes I just relate with what you're saying. And every day I go on the Quitting Kratom subreddits, and the one that's specific to what I used, which was the kava kratom extract drink, specifically because I can completely 100% relate to what everyone who posts on that subreddit is going through. And it's helpful for me to comment and encourage on something that's specific. I know so well, I remember so well how horrible that experience was for me, that it feels good to give back specifically on that, on my drug of choice. That's what I call it in the rooms, my drug of choice. But yeah, with that, I think we should maybe introduce the guest this week. Thanks for talking with me, Libby. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a good week. And hopefully I'll see you at one of those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good night.
All right, you too.
Welcome to the Kratom Sobriety Podcast. This is Charlie, and I'm here with our interviewee this week, Michael Charles from New Mexico, who's also known as MMC13 on the Sober Town podcast or in the I Am Sober community, which she'll talk about more when we get into her story. And thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Charlie. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, and you might remember Michael, she talked about her kava experience in our interview with Jimmy on our decoupling kava from kratom episode, and we really appreciated that. So with that context, could you introduce yourself to our listeners? They've heard your voice before. Now they can get to know you finally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a 44-year-old female. I've been in recovery since I was about 29, started drinking really young in my early teens. And so that's been what started my path on recovery. And in recovery communities was my struggles with alcohol. I came across Kratom about 4 years ago, I think, about 2020. And it was at a point in my alcohol recovery where I was feeling a little itchy. And so I think I was really looking for an alternative, something maybe safer that wouldn't be as destructive for me as alcohol. And I came across Kratom online and so many of its proponents just singing its praises. And Kratom is safe. It's wonderful. It changed my life. It helped me with pain. It helped me with anxiety. It's a great way to wind down. And it just sounded like this miracle plant. And as someone who has struggled with addiction, I'm always looking for the next miracle out there. And so it just sounded wonderful. And so I decided to give it a try. And yeah, at least initially, it was all the things it promised. I'm a sufferer of chronic back pain, and I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't struggling with that. I hardly noticed it anymore. And when I first discovered Kratom, I was just using the powdered leaf. And as of course, there's numerous forms of it out there now, but yeah, I started off ordering the powdered leaf from a vendor. I tried to quit Kratom about a year after I first started, I think. So probably around 2021, maybe I think my use went on a little longer than that. And I had been using it pretty regularly after I found it. I started to become a daily user, still holding on to that. Helping with the back pain, helping with the anxiety, and then taking a little extra on the weekends, chasing that euphoria feeling that I got when I first used it. But it got to where I was taking more and more and not accomplishing the same results. And some users are probably familiar with the term the wobbles. I used to take big spoonfuls of it and then would just feel awful, right? My vision was all funny and I was shaky and I was nauseous. And it was one of these mornings that I had just taken my spoonful of it and got the wobbles and felt really off. And I was like, I'm just sick of this stuff. I'm just done with it. And so I just threw out everything I had, not thinking anything of it. This was prior to when I realized it had addictive properties. And by that evening, I was starting to feel pretty crappy, and recognizing the symptoms of withdrawal, went online. And that's when I found the Facebook Quitting Kratom page and discovered this whole community of people that had been addicted to Kratom. And I went into it completely clueless. So my first time quitting Kratom was completely cold turkey from about a 50 to 70 gram per day addiction. And I went through a week of really acute withdrawals. I didn't sleep for 5 nights. I had the chills and the shakes and the night sweats and just everything opioid withdrawal causes. And of course, in this time, I spent a lot of time researching Kratom, learning about its properties, how it works on the opioid receptors in the brain. And I am someone who had never been addicted to opiates previously. I had taken a few more pain pills than I should have here or there from time to time, but I've never actively pursued any sort of opiates or gotten addicted to them. And so this was a whole new experience for me. And so after that week of acute withdrawals, I managed to go 10 weeks total without going back to using Kratom. But the post-acute withdrawal syndrome was what ultimately drove me back. I just had weeks and weeks of daily anxiety and daily complete lack of motivation and drive to do anything. Like just getting out of bed was a struggle. And I had to work and I had to take care of my dogs and I had to keep living. And so I ultimately ended up going back and using it just to try to feel normal again. Around this time is when I discovered, unfortunately, the side effect of being a member of a recovery community is that you also learn all the forms that a substance comes in. And that is where I discovered the kratom extract shots. And again, my little brain goes, ooh, bigger, better, faster, stronger. Let's give those a try. And so that's when I started dabbling with the extract shots. And that would have been 3, I think, at that point. So for about the last year, not the last year now, but the last year up until about March, for about a year prior to March of this year, I was taking the shots pretty regularly and got into doing, 5 to 7 shots a day at that point and was absolutely desperate. The money I was spending was astronomical. I couldn't function with or without it. I felt just as trapped as I did in my alcohol addiction, where you just can't imagine life with or without that substance. And so that's when I started looking into medication assisted therapy. And I discovered a clinic in Albuquerque that does provide Suboxone for kratom addiction and went through that clinic and got on Suboxone to get off of kratom. So I started Suboxone in March of this year. And I have been on it since. And it was a night and day change from when I tried to cold turkey off of it myself. I was terrified of making the leap and giving kratom up, but it was a nearly painless transition. Now, of course, the one drawback to Suboxone is that it also leads to physical dependence. And so with my provider, I will have to work on getting off of that at some point. But given that I did really develop addiction is multifaceted, and I have developed a very strong mental addiction to it to correlate with the physical, where the habit and the routine of it has become a part of it. And for me, currently having that daily thing that I still take helps with the mental piece of it. And I'm working with therapists. I'm working to get to a point where I can untangle that. And then ultimately, I will likely work with my provider on getting on the shots, the injections, rather than the oral medication, and then taper off from there. So
We've heard a lot of good feedback that Sublocade as a way to tapering off the Suboxone is not as difficult, and that people have really good experiences with that. So it sounds like you experienced kratom in different phases. First, it was the traditional powder, and you were able to get off of it yourself for 10 weeks. And then the extracts entered the picture. And obviously that's much stronger. Any general observations, the difference between those two different periods of use?
the extracts, I think, were harder for me to come to terms with stopping just because they are stronger, because the way they're manufactured. I think they really do lend themselves a lot more to that euphoria aspect of kratom use, whereas the powder had really just stopped being a positive thing in any way or shape for me. There was no reason for me to want to continue it. The liquid shots, it was really hard to come to terms with the fact that I was going to have to let go of that mental release and all the things that we tie to that. Learning how to live life as someone in recovery means learning whole new habits and whole new coping mechanisms about how you deal with your stress, how you deal with your sadness, how you deal with your joy. All of these things can be triggering to someone with addiction where we're used to reaching for something to either numb that thing or exemplify that thing, to use that thing as a part of the celebration. So there's a much bigger mental obstacle course, I think, when it comes to getting off of the extracts. Huge thing for me, of course, is my involvement in a recovery community. 2020 is also right around the time I discovered the I Am Sober online community and, of course, the Quitting Kratom support groups on Facebook. I regularly say on my podcast, connection beats addiction. And that has held true for me since really 2009, since the beginning of my recovery journey. Early on, it was AA and people that I met there. Later on, as technology has advanced, online groups have really brought me to find more people that think the way I do about addiction. I really don't believe there's any one size fits all pathway to recovery. And I've found a community that is very flexible and very understanding. And that's part of actually the trip that I'm on right now. So while I live in Albuquerque, I'm currently coming to you from Bethel, Maine. And I've been able to stop and see about 4 or 5 different people from my recovery community that are all over the United States. It's just been such a special experience.
Wow. So it sounds like before your Kratom experience, you had issues with alcohol primarily. Could you tell us briefly about that?
Sure. I am adopted. The home that I grew up in, my adoptive parents were normal drinkers. They drank on holidays. They were not the type to have parties or anything like that. I very rarely saw my parents drink alcohol, but I do know that my biological mother has struggled with alcoholism her whole life. And so I was genetically predisposed for addiction to alcohol and other substances. I always say I'm a very interesting case study in the nature versus nurture argument. But I went through a lot of really difficult emotional years in my early teenage years. About the time adolescence hit, I started struggling with really strong depression and impulsive actions and just rebelled against the world. And I struggled with a lot of bullying and a lot of feeling like I didn't belong. And when alcohol came into the picture, the bullying kind of stopped. I found out that people left me alone when I was at these parties and these events. And the alcohol helped me get over my shyness and helped me come out of that shell and discover that I could be funny and I could be bold. And so in the beginning, alcohol came into my life as this positive thing, quote unquote. And it quickly became a large part of my socialization. And so as I got older, I gravitated towards people who drank like I did. And by the time I was 19 years old, I was already physically dependent on alcohol. I couldn't even buy it legally, but I was waking up with the shakes in the morning. It was causing me problems with getting to work on time. The majority of my 20s were spent just in an alcoholic haze. The one thing I was able to maintain was working. I've always had a strong work ethic, and I've lived alone most of my life. And so there's never been a phase where I could not work. So I've maintained these jobs. Luckily, alcohol has not really damaged me too far in the career front, but any time that I wasn't at work, I was drinking in my 20s. It was just this 24-hour, 24/7 cycle. And so by the time I got into my late 20s, it became pretty unbearable. I was dealing with withdrawals every day and just living my life, going through the motions and feeling sick and miserable every day at work and just waiting to get home and take that first drink. And around 2009, I got desperate. There was one day that I woke up 2 or 3 hours late for work already, completely hungover, and called my boss and said, I'm not coming in. I've got to get myself into a rehab. And she knew a bit of my struggles. I'd talked to her about it a couple years prior, and I'd gone through the employee assistance program at work, working with a counselor, and been to some AA meetings and things like that at that time, trying to do it on my own. But I got desperate and realized I really needed help when I was 29 years old. And I went to a 30-day rehab at that point. And that was really the foundation that started my stronger commitment to recovery. And I will say I have not done it perfectly. I have certainly had my slips. I am a firm believer that recovery is not linear. And just because you slip up doesn't mean you go back to day zero. every day spent sober is something that they can never take away from you. And cumulatively, it adds up. So I quit drinking when I was 29. I spent the majority of my 30s sober. I had 8.5 years consecutively sober at one point. I started experimenting with drinking again in 2020. No surprise, all of these things somewhat line up with the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of working remotely, a social isolation, and all of those sort of things. I was also in a difficult romantic relationship at the time, and I was struggling with being uncomfortable in my home and struggling financially, and just it was the perfect storm for a relapse. So, but yeah, I knew at this point in my life that there's no way I could continue to drink the way I drink and live any sort of functional life. And so thankfully, I have not found myself in a place where I've completely gone back to drinking and given up hope. I've had some relapses that have lasted anywhere from a day to 3 weeks or so. But I have never strayed far from my recovery community over the last 4 years. And I actually just beat my longest streak of consecutive time since 2020, which is 6 months. So
Congratulations.
thank you.
Our history is a little bit similar. I also got sober in my 20s. I was sober through my 30s. My last drink was at the beginning of the pandemic, Friday the 13th, 2020. I think Tom Hanks got COVID the night before, something like that, and they canceled the first basketball game. And fortunately, I didn't know that you could have booze delivered to your home at the time. And I stayed in, and I got to a month. And then I started to do some recovery stuff, and it's stuck going on 4.5 years now.
Very nice.
It sounds like maybe Kratom didn't necessarily solve your alcohol problem. It looks like you were struggling, your timeline, you were struggling with both.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Kratom was definitely not a substitute for alcohol for me. It was very much something that I could use in conjunction with. So yeah, no, it was not the alternative that I was seeing. There was a period of time there where it scratched the itch a little bit, especially the extract shots. They would give that euphoric boost and it might get me through a night. But I am someone who will battle addiction through and through, and any substance that causes those sort of euphoric, mind-altering experiences is something that I have to be incredibly cautious around.
Did you quit the extracts and the alcohol around the same time?
This last go round, actually, yes. So it was in March, the last time I took Kratom and my last drink.
In terms of Kratom, did you have any health problems related to your Kratom use?
Not to my knowledge, aside from being that it acts on the opioid receptors, it definitely impacts the digestive tract. And so lots of difficulty with using the bathroom, and it becomes very uncomfortable. I won't go into graphic details, but lots of supplementing with not anti-diarrheal, the opposite, like fibers and things to try to get things moving, because it wreaks havoc on the stomach. And then the aforementioned wobbles and just making me feel crappy just from taking it. Now, I have read experiences of people that are absolutely terrifying, who have experienced seizures from it, there are a number of parents in the recovery group that cite that they lost children with no explanation other than the fact that they were using Kratom, who firmly believe that was the cause of their children's death. And I have no reason to doubt that. Kratom is something that it's not FDA regulated. There's very little that's known about it in the States, although the majority of the countries that export it don't even allow its use in their own countries. Let that speak for itself.
Yeah, we've had several of those parents on and hearing their stories. It's painful, and there is some complications in some of those deaths. There's reasons why it can be overcounted and undercounted with Kratom. There's just so much more research that they need to do. I know Kratom extracts are very expensive from my personal experience. How did that affect your wallet?
Oh, God. Deeply. I was absolutely getting into debt over my Kratom use. Like I do not have that flexible of a bank account. And that was part of my decision to get off of them. It was just not financially feasible. I mentioned earlier, I was taking 5 to 7 a day, and those little things at a pop are 20 to $25 each. I am not a movie star or a celebrity. I cannot afford a couple $100 a day habit of anything. So yeah, it was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
That was part of the decision to get off.
Definitely. It's way more expensive to booze. It would be like buying everybody drinks at the bar.
Like daily. Yeah, it's on me. Uh-huh.
And I know eventually some people, I think they go back to some of their drugs of choice because it's just, they're cheaper and more affordable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You hear that a lot about people who use Kratom to get off of opiates. Sadly, they'll go back to the opiates they were using because street drugs are cheaper by far, which is terrifying.
I know Suboxone really helped with your withdrawals. Was there anything else that eased that early phase?
The biggest thing for me is just talking about it. I have to have that accountability network. I have to have people in my world that know what I'm going through and what my goals are. If I'm not accountable to others and I'm just trying to do it on my own, it's so much easier to just slip up and go back to old habits. And I learned that with my alcohol addiction as well. There's so much shame and stigma around addiction that it's really terrifying to talk about it. It's terrifying to admit it to family, to friends, to employers. You just never know what sort of a reaction you're going to get. And so that's why finding a recovery community has been completely crucial for me, because I know anytime I talk about the struggles, if I talk about a setback, if I talk about anything, they're going to accept me with open arms. Not a single one of them is going to judge me, no matter how many times I mess up. They're just going to encourage me to keep coming and try again and get up and dust myself off and don't give up. And together we're working really hard to do what we can to break down the stigmas around addiction and make it an acceptable topic of conversation. Because the only way the majority of people beat addiction is by getting help in one form or another. And you can't get help unless you're willing to talk about what you're going.
How was the pause this time? I know when you first run at quitting the powder, that was a big issue. How are you feeling this time?
I have had almost no pause thanks to the Suboxone treatment. I will say, so prior to my Kratom use, I was never really somebody who struggled with anxiety. Anxiety has not played a huge part in my life. I never used to get it outside of situationally, right? In circumstances that it would make perfect sense that anyone would feel anxious. I do believe that Kratom messed up the wiring in my brain so badly that I now carry a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. So I struggle from anxiety now more than I ever did 4+ years ago. And so out of anything, I would say that's the one thing that maybe has still cropped its head up a few times. Waking up in the morning with the heart racing and the butterflies in the stomach for no real clear reason. That does go back a bit, though, to what we spoke about previously with my kava use, because I did, of course, utilize kava in conjunction with kratom for a while in there. And kava can cause rebound anxiety, especially for somebody who's suffered with GAD or panic attacks. And so I strongly suspect most of those periods where I've struggled with anxiety has been a time when I've experimented with kava again. And so it's hard to say if that has something to do with kratom, if that's the rebound anxiety from kava, if it's a mixture of the two. It's just impossible to flesh those two out from each other at those phases.
And I know the kava also, you had an allergic reaction to that as well, right?
Yeah, there's actually something, I can't remember the term for it, but kava causes a type of dermatitis. And it's known in the islands where it's heavily used as dragon skin or dragon scales. And I believe that's exactly what happened to me. I ended up with this red, patchy eczema type flaring around my eyes. My whole body just scaled and got this dry, flaky, dead skin. And then in the creases and areas, it was so painful and raw and tender, and it was absolutely awful. My dermatologist diagnosed it as eczema, But and he wasn't certain that it was a reaction to the kava, and so there could be an argument made for that. But the timing of it, the fact that I have never experienced anything like this before in my life, and that I was just heavily abusing kava for about the week before this happened. It's I know correlation does not equal causation, but in this case, I'm nearly certain that's what did it.
Yeah, it's well known that kava can do that in some people, and then other people who take a lot. It is surprising that just after 1 week of use that it happened, but it's totally associated with that, and it's known.
And I do have a diagnosis of psoriasis and eczema. So as someone who has that and has had a history of that, perhaps that's why I was that much more susceptible to it happening.
And you've been off the kava and you haven't had the symptoms since then.
Nope.
You have a podcast called Early Days. Tell us about that.
I do. So the Early Days podcast is on the Sobertown podcast platform. Early Days is my own experiences and focusing a lot on the early part of sobriety. And one of the benefits of having slipped and having relapsed over the last 4 years is that going through those things that we struggle with in early sobriety is still relatively fresh in my head. And so I'm talking about a lot of the topics like withdrawal symptoms, or how do you get past those first few days of strong cravings, or the shame and the guilt around it, and normalizing relapse, and really trying to shed a light on that area where so many people struggle with seeking support and with feeling embarrassed and feeling like they don't deserve help or they're a failure. Really working to focus on breaking those stigmas and trying to help people come out of the shadows and seek support and seek help earlier rather than feeling like there's no reason to keep trying.
Well, we'll make sure to have a link in the show notes to that so people can check that out. And can you tell us a little bit more about the I Am Sober community?
So I Am Sober is an app, can be found in all the platforms. And I Am Sober is where I discovered the majority of my online sobriety community. I downloaded the app back in 2020 looking for just a recovery tracking app to count my days. Did not realize that it had this whole community behind it. So I Am Sober is essentially like Facebook for recovery. There is a wall where you can make posts and people can comment on them. You get to build up this community. There's also Zoom meetings that are available. Now, they are non-IAS sponsored, but those of us who are in the IAS community have taken on sharing them. And that is where I started to really build the connections with the folks that I am on this trip seeing. I am a host on Sundays for a ladies Zoom meeting. So we have meetings available every day of the week. On the Sobertown podcast website, there are calendars available for people to be able to find the dates for those Zoom meetings to join us. You do not have to join the I Am Sober community to participate in those meetings if you don't want to. It's just an additional resource and tool for those who are looking for something to maybe help track the days and help find other people in recovery.
Are you the lone wolf in there about Kratom, or is there some other folks that struggle with Kratom in that community?
You see? Yeah, Kratom every once in a while pop up on there. So the way the program is built, you can set it for any addiction that you have struggled with. You can have co-addictions and have different dates tracked for whatever substance it is. And yeah, it's a small subset, but it's growing for sure. I think that the issues with Kratom are still relatively new. And I think over the coming decade, it's definitely going to grow and become known as a problematic substance. I will say I have an amazing doctor who had never heard of Kratom before I brought my struggles with it to him. And this man has dove in headfirst into learning about it. He's gone to conferences about it now. He works at a teaching hospital, and so he teaches his incoming residents about it. And it's just been so cool to see him be on the cutting edge and on the cusp of this and being willing to help me and offer support and learn about it and just to know what it is and know that it's out there.
we like to lighten things up a little bit and talk about some fun things before we're getting towards the end of the interview. What is on your playlist when you're listening to music?
Oh gosh. My playlist it's multifaceted, and I am not organized enough to have like actual playlists with genres under them. So I just have one massive Spotify playlist called Liked Songs, and it has anything from the Labyrinth soundtrack to Slayer. I listen to it all. It really just kind of depends on the mood that I'm in that day. Road tripping music, a lot of what I've been listening to lately is kind of easier, bluesy, folk grass kind of stuff. Some Mumford and Sons, some Death Cab for Cutie, kind of that easier, mellower sort of. Not so much the metal and the punk right now, but there's certainly a good portion of that in there as well.
You are traveling. Do you have any other destinations on your bucket list that you'd like to
Yeah,
go
so this afternoon I am on my way to Bangor, Maine. I have never been I've never been to Maine. I've never been to anywhere on the northeast coast of the states higher than North Carolina prior to this trip. Bangor was my final destination as a huge Stephen King fan. He's the one who got me into the horror genre. I read my first King at teen and I've been hooked ever since. And so I want to get a picture of the infamous Stephen King gate at the front of his house and see the cemetery from Pet Cemetery. On my way up here, a friend of mine in my recovery community saw that I was going to be in Maine and reached out and said, "Hey, I live in Quebec City. If you want to come up and visit me for a couple days, you're welcome." And so I will also be taking my first venture ever into Canada to go and spend a couple days with her. Might experience a Nordic spa, and I am totally obsessed with old abandoned buildings, and she's going to take me into a part of the city that was built in the 1600s. So I will be in absolute heaven.
Sounds exciting.
Definitely.
What is your top tip for someone quitting Kratom?
Get connected, find a community, find support. It doesn't necessarily have to be an addiction community if that's not really your thing. Have your trusted friend, your family, whoever you can lean on to be your accountability buddy. Get other people involved to help you hold yourself accountable. I would strongly recommend getting connected with an addiction community because I think you will find support and understanding in a way that you just struggle to find in anyone who has never struggled with addiction before. There's something to be said for talking with people who just get it. Any of us who have been in addiction and recovery for a while have struggled with trying to explain it to those who haven't had it before, and you can feel like you're beating a head against a wall. So connecting with others who have been there has been an absolute game changer for me. That's connection beats addiction.
And if you could send yourself a note for a year in the future to yourself, what would that message be?
Self-care is not selfish. Don't forget to put yourself first every once in a while and stay true, stay authentic.
I like that. Self-care is not selfish. Anything you'd like to say to wrap up things? A parting message?
I would just encourage folks to check out Sobertown Podcast if you're interested. There's lots of stuff available there. It's a lot more than podcasts. There's those schedules to the meetings. There's tons of tips and tricks and tools and ways to get connected. Feel free to contact me about the Early Days podcast, or if you're interested in hearing more about my experiences with alcohol or kratom or kava, I can be reached at EarlydaysPC@gmail.com. Yeah, happy to help anybody who's interested in getting some support.
Thank you for sharing all those resources.
My pleasure. It's been wonderful getting to chat with you a little bit.
Same here. All right. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Kratom in the headlines. Hi, everybody. This is Jacob. And this week's Kratom in the headlines is a short documentary. It's a little bit less than 30 minutes long. on Kratom, and this is a new documentary, and it is called The Growing Toll of America's Booming Kratom Industry, and it's from Bloomberg. The video is essentially about how the Southeast Asian plant Kratom has grown dramatically in recent years, spurring a lucrative industry and a lobbying effort, and while simultaneously worrying health experts who fear its addictive effects and point to thousands of related deaths. So this documentary, they focus on how the substance is being promoted, being made more potent through extracts, and how some users are ultimately ending up addicted and dead. Just to talk about the arc of the documentary and its facets and focuses, it starts out talking a bit about what Kratom is, where it comes from, all that sort of thing. It talks about its efficacy and its potential risks, so its use for pain and depression and all those things, and then its risk of addiction and in some rare cases even death. They go to Indonesia, they talk to some farmers, they then talk about Kratom in the US, and they talk a bit about dosages and how that can play an effect on various things. They also try to balance it by showing how it's helped and harmed users, so they feature some addicts that use it as a harm reduction method, and also talk to loved ones and highlight some consequences of the use of Kratom. And the back half of the documentary really focuses on the concentrated products, particularly 7-hydroxymitragynine or mitragynine, also known as 7-OH. And it also talks about the lack of regulation in most states and the lack of FDA regulation. It talks about deaths from Kratom, highlights a wrongful death lawsuit, and that's basically the arc of the documentary. So it's pretty wide-ranging and encompassing. Probably not much new that you may learn from it, but I do think if you're interested in keeping up on what's happening in the media around Kratom, or if you want to share with others who maybe you have concern around their Kratom usage, or you're trying to educate your family about what this stuff is and all that stuff, it's probably a good documentary for that sort of thing. So that is Kratom in the headlines this week. We hope you keep it Kratom free. Resource of the week. Hey Kratom quitters, I've got this week's resource for y'all. I want to talk a little bit about how diet affects addiction and recovery. So there's a short article that's actually from a recovery center based in Spain called the Phoenix Programs. I stumbled upon this somehow, but it seems like this really kind of high-end, bougie recovery center in Spain. So if you've got some cash and got some time and maybe you want to go recover in the beautiful, sunny coast of Spain, check out the Phoenix Programs and see if that's for you. But for the rest of us that are maybe just looking to improve things a little bit while we're recovering from our Kratom addictions, I want to talk a bit about diet and how that affects addiction and recovery. So we'll link this short article in the show notes, but basically it just covers kind of two questions, which are what has food got to do with addiction, and can a healthy diet really help you recover? So the article starts out by saying that following a healthy, balanced diet has been shown to increase success at recovering from addiction. It allows you to reduce cravings, improve mental health, and heals the damage done by lack of nutrients and such when you're in the midst of substance abuse. Poor nutrition will lead to stress and ill health and is linked to increased cravings and relapse. Drug and alcohol abuse can suppress the appetite, as Kratom can do, because Kratom addicts can be apt to not eat enough because they're trying to time their doses and get the most benefit out of them. What else can happen is substance abuse can often lead to vomiting. Kratom does that, diarrhea, damage to the guts, all that plant material for some of us can't be good. So that often leads to low levels of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, all that sort of stuff. So the article notes that complex carbohydrates, amino acids, fatty acids, omega-3 and 6, and B vitamins and folic acid are especially beneficial to recovering addicts' brain health, and studies have shown that to be the case. How do you go about getting those foods from your diet? There's a lot of healthy calories in complex carbs, in things like whole grain bread, cereals, brown rice, etc. Moderate proteins, portions from meat, fish, eggs, or vegan options like tofu or lentils are really good. Healthy fats such as olive oil and seed oils versus butter are a good choice. Vitamin and mineral rich foods, your leafy greens, dairy products, nuts, and seeds. Eating a full plate of fruits and vegetables and leafy greens a day is really good. And then most importantly, probably is drinking a lot of water. A full 2 liters to a gallon of water a day is what's essentially recommended. So I've incorporated a lot of healthy eating and healthy kind of exercise habits into my recovery, not only from Kratom, but from previous addictions. And I found it really beneficial. Eating healthy, you wake up feeling better, you're not sluggish, your body's more in tune, all that sort of stuff. I'd highly recommend you check out this article, check out some other resources which are readily available just by Googling diet and exercise and all that stuff, and you'll find a lot of good resources on how to eat healthy and really boost your recovery. So that's our resource of the week this week, and I hope you keep it Kratom free.